Okay. Custom. Yeah. You had telemetry questions.
Sorry?
You put a question about telemetry in the agenda.
Oh yeah, it's a question. I don't have an answer. It's if anyone knows what are the plans, I would appreciate to get the information.
There are some PRs open to actually resolve this. It's still an open discussion point. There's some discussion going on. I'm not sure the actual resolution right now.
So first of all, are we going to support the telemetry APIs that is getting promoted to beta in Istio? So basically my questions were around two areas. One is the API surface, because there is effort to promote the Istio telemetry to beta. And I'm trying to make sure that everything we promote will not create migration problems. And the second problem is if part of the ambient we want to make any changes to the, since we're having slightly different metrics, and L7 is now captured in waypoints in a slightly different way. If there is any interest or to also support open telemetry semantic conventions as an additional metric definition, if you want. Since this is kind of the opportunity to do so, because I mean, we can do it at later time, of course, but it will be probably the right time to do it in. Yeah, Kit.
Just a clarifying question for me, because I'm a little bit ignorant here as far as zTunnel. But does zTunnel support telemetry API at all today? I don't know that they're a protobuf definition. Go ahead, Cotton.
No, as far as I know, it doesn't. But waypoints do.
Waypoints do. Right.
Waypoints do to some extent. I mean, it's a workload selector versus attachment to routes versus attachment to. So it's the same problem we discussed for authorization, where attaching telemetry policy at the waypoint level means that the entire namespace gets the same policy. You lose granularity, which previously you had with the workload selector, and some things that you can express with Istio Classic with sidecars, where you can set access log on one particular workload to be JSON, another workload to use text, and set completely different settings by workload will be pretty weird in a gateway, because you cannot have really one request generate a JSON access log, the other one a text, and each with a different format. It gets messy.
So does telemetry API not currently allow you to set does it allow you to set a workload selector for telemetry API resource targeting a gateway? So like, what telemetry API, I guess my question is, did telemetry API work for waypoints before the target ref work?
It works by selecting the entire the workload, and that implies that you know how to select the workload. It's not documented. I don't think we have an official way. Don't you do it for other things? And yeah, the granularity and selections are the problems with the telemetry API.
Okay, so it seems like we need someone to take up kind of consolidating and refining all these questions.
Yeah, that is part. There's a PR for sort of resolving all telemetry related topics for ambient beta. It's in Lynn's list. There's multiple.
It was a PR or was a tracking issue?
It's both. There's a tracking issue.
Oh.
Yeah.
There's actually code?
No, it's a design. It's a design document requirement. Okay.
Yeah. In more practical terms, is we want to make sure that the other meeting, I mean, we do not promote the telemetry to beta until we have an answer to those questions. And if we need to make some code changes, it's better to make them before it is promoted to beta. That was the context, really.
Yeah. Okay. If I remember rightly, Sanjeev, Justin was supposed to be corralling, making progress on that. Has much progress been made over the last month?
So there's 3 or 4 people tagged on the PR, but I think everybody kind of just incidentally working on it. I can help.
Okay, but it's not actually being driven.
Not quite driven by a single person. It's
okay. Right, because I haven't heard of much progress on this in the last month. I'm going to bring that up with the TOC, right? Because it's pretty obvious that this needs some fairly urgent attention.
Yeah, and I'm
okay.
happy to volunteer some time on it if I can help.
Please keep me as a loop as well. I'm pretty interested in this subject.
I might have time to work on this. The captured doc is in a much more stable state, actually, to the point where we've created a tracking issue for work items. I think the authorization policy stuff is fairly, it needs another review, but it doesn't need too much more. So I might have bandwidth for this, seeing as, I'm a professional doc jockey rather than a code writer anyway. So I can help, I think, but I'll bring it up with the TSC. Yeah, I think that's probably actually accurate. I think, well, there are some other things, right? Like you said, open telemetry conventions, what signals should be produced. This the selection.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I agree, Custom, overall.
And for the second question, we are not, the second one, adopting open telemetry standard metrics, it's valuable, but we are not necessarily time constrained. We can say that Ambient launches with Istio Classic telemetry with a subset of it, and we need to define it. That's no problem, but can be solved. And later on, saying as an extra feature, we also support open telemetry naming instead of our naming.
Yeah, there's a lot of options there. I agree. Keith?
Yes, what I'm hearing, just to try to maybe summarize the problem statement here for the API concerns with telemetry, is that we have this resource, telemetry API, that has been around for 3 years. I think the commit I saw in the code was around 3 years ago. That's fairly widely used for telemetry configuration Istio, for sidecars, and what I'm hearing is that we maybe haven't done the work to ensure that that resource can function in an ambient world, or at best, most charitably, we don't know whether that resource can survive in an ambient world. Is that kind of the synopsis?
Yes. I think. Oh, go ahead, Jay, sir.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I just want to point out that I think there's really 2 things at play, right? There's the telemetry API, which is one thing, whether or not it needs to be adopted by Ambient or not. But then there's also the actual telemetry being generated, which is potentially not correct, or not exactly, I shouldn't say that, but maybe not exactly what's wanted or needed for Ambient. And that issue that Sanjeev mentioned earlier has a dialogue in it that talks not about the telemetry API, but talks about the telemetry itself and any impact that the Istio metrics, for example, being scraped for Prometheus today, and how they might be impacted or changed even slightly. So I feel like there's 2 things. I just want to make sure that I think there's 2 different things. There's the telemetry API and support for that. And then there's actual, what does it mean to the existing Istio metrics when you're talking about Ambient, and then potential directions that it could go with open telemetry and so forth.
Yeah, correct, Jay.
On this subject, since waypoints are gateways, theoretically, there is no change in the L7 telemetry compared to what gateways in Istio do. At least that's my understanding. there may be some bugs where some information is not tracked correctly or is not reproduced, and definitely we need to fix them as bugs. But it's not changing what gateways do, but it will certainly have an impact on tools like Kiali or any dashboards and alerts. And they may need to make changes, and that's why I kind of raised the issue of, is it the right time to adopt open telemetry naming convention? Because if they have to do work, it may be more valuable for them to do the work and, support the open telemetry, which is much more broadly adopted than by others, and get on with it.
Yeah, you're right. So the waypoint is a proxy. There's already support for telemetry there. The only difference is that the main difference, right, is that you don't have a source and a destination proxy anymore. So the reporting for ambient is potentially slightly different, right? If you've got it coming from zTunnel or you've got it coming from waypoint, it's different than having a reporter equal source, reporter equal destination. So that's actually one of the focuses in that issue, is to see, well, is there any impact to that in ambient that we need to take care of in the telem? As for OTel or something like that, I have nothing against that. But I think personally that Istio implementations for waypoint and zTunnel should provide the legacy telemetry, even at the same time if there's a new approach being introduced, for continuity's sake.
I completely agree, and that's ideal. But if you look at how it is implemented in with sidecars and waypoint, as you just described, it may not be possible to achieve full parity. So again,
well, I think customers, there's a meaningful difference between equivalent schema but different population and different schema, right?
I know. Schema is not so different. It's just different naming. But yes, completely agree. There are degrees, but the question is, do we want to have 3 schemas for telemetry or 3 variation or 2? I mean, I'm not. I mean, that's mostly for Kiali people and for people who work on Prometheus and other things to evaluate what the current status is for waypoint and if it can be made work with what it is or small fixes, or if it requires more work than what they believe it's right to do.
I would encourage people to read through that issue and add thoughts there if you have some.
Does somebody have a link? Is that the one
I
you
threw
linked?
it in there.
Yeah, okay, it's in the chat. Okay. Let's move it to the doc. Okay. Well, I think the most important thing is to just get this moving. So I'll spend some time on that this week. Yeah, we need some clear ownership. Like, I think people have a broad idea about what needs to happen. We just need to get it set out.
Yeah, I'll toss some of my thoughts in the doc. Yeah, I think it's one of the things that comes to my mind is that we do have APIs that don't work with zTunnels, like request authentication, for example. So there are decisions that we can make here for the beta of Ambient, and even the beta telemetry API. It really depends on kind of what we want to optimize for, but I'll leave more details in the issue.
Yeah, so folks, please pile on to the issue if you have thoughts. Okay.
One general question is it in deployment, in terms of deployment priorities, is it more important to support the telemetry API or to ensure that standard monitoring tools like Prometheus can adequately get the metrics? Because I would imagine most people would be using tools like Prometheus as compared to the telemetry API. Is that accurate?
My personal opinion is that, I mean, we did some statistics on how many people use the telemetry API, and it's not so high. So, but at the same time, having some, TLE or some dashboards keep working, I think it's not broken by moving to telemetry. I think it's probably the most critical right now. So if we can have, adopt use Waypoint and have TLE still working, it's probably good enough for a beta, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, we have tested some of the metrics of harvested from zTunnel and so on. They appear to work.
And it's actually a good start. We can just document it, and that's kind of the starting point, and we can adjust for GA.
Yeah, I would +1 to that. I think it's more important that the telemetry, the out-of-the-box telemetry experience is working and relatively stable than that the API works. Feel free to +1 or -1 Costin's opinion. Okay. Any more on that topic? All right, we'll move the dialogue over to the issue while we work on getting a plan together, but it shouldn't take too much to get that plan ironed out. And I'm happy to help with that. Okay, John's not here, but
yeah, this is just moving zTunnel to the Rust TLS, basically, which lets us wrap multiple crypto libraries, which shouldn't be something that is visible to people outside of that. But if you're interested, take a look. It's still WIP, but that should make things a little easier for people that want to use different crypto libraries. If you don't want to use boring, for instance, or you want to do something else there.
does it have any other visible effects, performance, etc., Ian?
This is Ben, but no, I don't think so.
No, sorry, Ben.
Yeah, I don't believe it does. It should be purely transparent unless you're somebody who's interested in how it's changing the internals of zTunnel right now. It might make multi-arch builds a little easier, but that's still TBD.
I have a question. What's the timeline for mask in Rust TLS?
I don't know.
Mask or quick?
Well, yeah, quick, of course, but mask depends on quick, which is coupled with SSL, at least for Google.
Yeah.
I just want to understand if is it going to like push it forward, backwards, because I don't quite know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think that a lot of the TLS stuff it is sort of in Rust TLS is sort of independent of the actual library you use. So I would hope that if you need a specific library for some purpose under the hood, it wouldn't make a big difference, but I don't know. There may be stuff in the TLS primitives that's changed for quick support and Rust TLS. I'll need to check on the status of that.
Yeah, let's just check quick, because quick is definitely coupled with TLS. It's not separable.
I mean, there's a quick module in Rust TLS.
Yeah, but then who's going to mask for that module? It's...
Sure, but yeah, I mean,
there's a closed issue for supporting quick. I don't see anything. So it looks like that Rust TLS upstream supports it now, but I don't see anything outstanding around that. So I would assume that it's in place. Yeah, there are a bunch of closed quick PRs and issues, but no open ones that I see.
I
Is-
see some structs around it when it comes to Quick, but not seeing anything definitive as far as like what support looks like.
Yeah, and I think it looks like there are some minor issues around. I think I see one thing around TLS 1.2 enables for quick. There's some issue, but like it looks like mostly a few minor bugs, which I would rather fix in Rust TLS if we need to. Nothing big. It looks like the fundamental support is in there. And since we already had, I think, Intel people asking for Rust TLS because they wanted to use a different crypto library, I'd rather get that in place architecturally in zTunnel, and then we can always, add anything we need around quick corner cases.
Right, Sanjeev, I assume this is important for you, right? Because Red Hat likes to just distribute OpenSSL-based builds rather than boring-based builds.
No, we do have a pips flavor of Istio. I mean, right now we're not shipping ambient in any case, but we actually fork upstream in order to build with the FIPS crypto, and that was
Yeah, but that's with OpenSSL, not boring, right?
I'll need to check. It's not with boring, but I'll need to check.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I seem to
I
remember
think
Red
that's
Hat.
true. No, you're right. We've only distributed OpenSSL to this point, and that's one of the biggest problems that we have is doing that conversion every time from boring to open.
Yeah, and the default is Istio is still going to ship FIPS compliant boring as the crypto implementation, so that won't change.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good to everybody, I guess. Do we have any other ad hoc agenda? There've been some updates, the waypoint capture doc I'm happy to go through, but I don't want to preempt by going through a 50-page document again.
Is it expected for 121 to come out this week? I know the RC one was cut yesterday.
I don't know if we have the build lead on here. Anyone know? I don't know.
It was supposed to be Monday, I think. Can check the channel.
Yeah, the release doc still says the 19th, so it's not quite right.
Yeah, looks like they're working on release docs, so should be soon, I think.
Yeah, I'll check with Eric.
Ian, do you have the tracking issue for the waypoint capture stuff handy?
Yeah, I'll add it.
Yeah, so just on that front, we think the waypoint capture doc is far enough along that folks can at least start creating some PRs for some of the pieces. There's still some things that need to be resolved in the doc, but the doc is really 3 design docs in one at this point, and so we can start moving some of the parts forward, but we'll still try to push, even though John's not here, we'll still try to push for some formal review this week. If there are no other topics, the one thing I would say about the doc, it's really 3 design documents, but they're welded together. The first one is traffic redirection to a waypoint, or the redirection part. The second part is what we call the binding part, which is figuring out how to send redirected traffic to a specific listener on a gateway. And the third part is generation, where we generate gateways following the standard gateway API specification from Istio and Gamma resources. And so binding and generation are kind of 2 sides of the same coin, right? You can use generation, or you can manually write configs, and binding figures out how to make sure that the traffic ends up where it's supposed to be. The binding and generation parts are mostly for standardization purposes. The redirection part is what's intended for the early part of the implementation, because we can have the stock Istio waypoints work without really worrying about binding or generation. It's a brief summary of what the doc update looks like. But yes, it's a large doc, even though I've deleted about 20 pages out of it the last week. But yes, it's still definitely review comments welcome. There's a bunch of open things, but the more substantive things are pretty set at this point. So I'm happy to spend more time on it if people want, because it's such a large and important thing. But also, if people want to get the hell out of this meeting and we have no other agenda, I'm totally happy to do that too.
I had one quick question, which maybe is a stupid one, and I think I put it in the doc, but I'll ask it again here. It is conceivable that, if I'm reading it correctly, that you could have a waypoint on a workload and a waypoint on a service that also fronts that workload, right? If you had 2 completely different waypoints that are, and it would go through both. It would go through both happily, I'm sure. That may not be something you would want as a user necessarily, or it may, I don't know, but that's an acceptable state, right? We're saying that that's fine. We don't want to do any intelligence to try to quote unquote deduplicate that. We would want them to go through if it so happened that they both were there.
I'm not sure that we actually want to go through both. You obviously the client has to address things differently, right, to end up in one or the other.
Right.
Right. And so there's the question, right, should a service capturing waypoint go through a workload capturing waypoint?
Basically, yes.
Yes. I think most users would expect that not to happen.
Right.
And so I think we should probably do something to prevent it, and that the document should probably clarify that.
Okay. Yeah, it's a little tricky, but I was curious.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think on that note, talking with Steven yesterday, it sounds like either is a totally viable option. There's not a big complexity difference to figure it out. And presently, I think he is saying if it goes through a service waypoint, it's not going to go through a workload waypoint in his sandwich implementation.
Yeah.
I think it's important to think of this as API, from API perspective and policies perspective. The end result doesn't matter where it goes and how it's implemented, including sidecars, by the way, is that all the policies that the user has defined are applied properly. So it may go to one endpoint, may go to sidecars, it may go to multiple, east-west gateways and through a longer path, in some cases for multi-network, for example. But the only guarantee is that whatever is in the API has been applied. And proxyless is another example where we need to focus on application of the policies, not on how, those are details of how it is implemented.
Right. So if we can safely deduplicate and guarantee that all policies are still applied, then we're fine. If we get to the point where we're
Exactly.
trying to get cute and we skip a policy, then that's not okay. Yeah.
Yeah, for example, if
Right,
you
I
have,
think-
some, yeah, go ahead, Louis.
Just on that front specifically, there are workload attached policies and gateway attached policies, right? Workload attached policies like authorization policy, for example. zTunnel is right now the only thing that actually enforces workload attached policies in the ambient model. You can obviously have a waypoint sit in front of two workload traffic and attach policy to that gateway. But it's to that gateway only, right? So there's no ambiguity about the attachment.
There is a bit of, it's a bit more complicated because policies attached to backend, that's clear. There is no concern here. I think we discussed you can represent workloads as a backend type, and any policy attached to backend is fine. Now, if you attach a policy to a route, it gets a bit more complicated because in gateway model, you have the front end, which is something with an address and perhaps an IP. And you can attach policy at listener level. At that level, then you have routes, if it's L7, and you can attach policies to the routes. And the route can be, have as parent multiple front ends. And finally, it goes to the backend. I know how the last part I understand it, but how policies attached to a route and attached to a listener in a gateway would apply to workloads, it's a bit of a mystery to me.
Okay, so in the spec, if you want a waypoint to handle two workload traffic, you have to have a very specific type of listener, right? That must be capable right now of handling either the proxy protocol or the HBone protocol. So the listener has to be declared like that. It can be inferred from the gateway class, but effectively that's what's happening. You can attach policy to that listener, or you can attach policy to the gateway that listener resides in. But either way, that policy is attached to the gateway effectively, right, to the waypoint. That's the only way you can do it. So that's not clear in the doc, but John and I have definitely tried to make that clear. If you go through the different binding examples, or the different ways of configuring waypoints, we explicitly now say which ones can handle two workload traffic and which ones can't. And only the HBone and proxy sandwich ones can handle two workload traffic. In theory, a freebind implementation with tproxy could also handle it, but I don't know if anybody's going to actually implement that. So that one's a bit more theoretical.
And
that helps.
there is another small use case that
I can present that actually and show it.
Yeah, there is another use case that we may need to consider, which is the persistent session filters that we just fixed, where a regular HTTP, any HTTP frontend or whatever can use a header or cookie to go straight to a particular.
Oh, sure. But that's a specific type of listener, right? That's a forward proxy with a custom route, right?
It's a standard HTTP listener with persistent sessions enabled, where you can actually individually address endpoints.
Yeah. So if you folks look, so there's this section which uses a well-known listener name to indicate that if it's just an opaque receiver of waypoint traffic, you have a declaration that looks like this. And then we go through, hold on. I've gone too far, sorry. These are all the different possible binding variations. Right, so there's, the very simple HTTP style gateway. It has a lot of limitations. Right, so it can't act as a waypoint for two workload traffic. Right, because it really only handles services. There's a TLS SNI based binding, which has a similar problem. In theory, you could make it work for two workload traffic, but you'd have to be able to deal with every workload's name, right? Because you have to use host names in SNI, and so that's probably not that practical. There's freebind, right? Using OS mechanisms to listen to the actual addresses of services and pods as IPs. Probably, again, not super practical, but something we could do. It's something we actually did in Sidecar. I'm not boring you, Mitch.
Not at all.
I thought that was a big yawn.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize my mic got unmuted. No, that's my family eating breakfast in the background.
That was classic. And then there's the proxy protocol, the stuff that Stephen's been working on. That one probably is pretty practical. So that would probably be what we recommend people use for 2 workload traffic. And like we said earlier, and it's kind of repeated from above, you have to have a listener basically declaring that you're supporting the proxy protocol or HBAN. And the rules for those bindings are listed below.
So, Louis, what I was trying to get to is that we should have some provisions that if you have an HTTP, standard HTTP listener, and you enable the persistent session, this would be effectively, or could be treated as, workload.
Yeah, I mean, I would put
It's
it
not
into
necessarily
the
proxy.
Yes, I would put it into that would work with the simple listener model, right? But it's just, I would call that persistent session rather than 2 workload. And we could, like, I'm happy to add a section to the doc to explain the difference to people.
Yeah,
Right,
we
one
could
is-
use the difference because with header is not persistent. You can put any, IP port and actually go to a particular endpoint just
Yeah,
like you
no,
can with a
but
proxy protocol.
But it's like it's implementation dependent, right? Which token you use to do stickiness, right? And it could be very hard
Yes.
or very soft.
Or something we can standardize. Yes, absolutely.
But I don't want to I want to be very clear not to necessarily conflate that with directly addressing the workload IP, and you're guaranteed to end up there.
That's clear. I understand. And yeah, okay.
Okay. Anyway, there's a lot there. So maybe look at the revision history in the doc if you're wondering what's changed. Probably since last Tuesday when John made his round of updates and then I made mine. I made a lot yesterday, so there's still a few open issues, and there's probably some details. So, right, probably one thing that's pointing out, like we have all these binding variations. Each one is probably worthy of its own design document, and so these are more kind of summaries. And also the generation stuff is probably worthy of its own design document. But it's included here because putting all the 3 pieces together help tell the story. But I expect over time that these individual sections will get more detail, but shouldn't block the approval of this document. Okay. Any other questions about this or clarifications I can provide while people are here?
Maybe I should read the doc for this, but can you provide one sample use case for a scenario where you need a waypoint on a service and a waypoint on a particular workload?
You want L7 telemetry for traffic to the workload.
You can get that from by extending.
I mean, yes, you could extend zTunnel.
No, not zTunnel. I mean, so are you saying we cannot? There is telemetry you cannot get on a per workload basis from a waypoint front-ending a service?
You mean workload address traffic, Louis? Something that would skip the service?
Yes, right. There are 2 types of traffic, Sanji, right? There's traffic that addresses a service and traffic that addresses a pod or workload directly. That's what this doc refers to when we talk about 2 workload traffic or 2 service traffic. It's what the client is addressing. If the client is directly addressing the pod, right, and you're only capturing service traffic, it won't go through the waypoint. Right? It'll go direct.
Yeah. Just
Warning.
What is a scenario where a service has certain clients address individual workloads and other clients address the service itself?
Stateful sets, out-of-band discovery mechanisms for databases like Cassandra.
In those cases, most clients directly access the individual workloads. No,
Yes, they do.
it's a mix of both in those cases.
You can have a mix because the service, they also expose the service for higher level functions, right? So you have like administrative functions go through the service and data reads might go through some sharded out-of-band discovery mechanism.
But because you're asking about telemetry, I want to put a strong warning that we should ever consider having telemetry that is, has the cardinality of IPs. We have the canonical service, so even if you are going to individually to workload, telemetry should reflect the canonical service, which is kind of an abstract concept or whatever it is, even if you talk directly with workloads, not IPs. We still need to track by lower cardinality stuff.
Yeah, that's a good topic for the telemetry document about the cardinalities, if we're going to make some schema adjustments.
I'm not sure that should be the case, because when stateful workloads are sort of synchronizing with each other, they aren't sending traffic to the logical service. They're sending to each other as individual workloads, and that should not be counted in telemetry as traffic sent to the logical service.
Yeah,
Right.
but
I mean,
cardinality
that's
is
what
already
happened.
too high.
Right. That's what happens with Sidecar today. And yeah, so I think this is where the telemetry API would be useful, right? Is in cardinality control. Custom, I think. I don't know if we've blown out on this yet.
Going back to the use case, you said the one use case was when there's a service which some clients access through individual workloads and some other clients access, or some other operations are accessed through the logical service, and yet you want L7 telemetry for the accesses that go directly to the workloads.
Yes, that would be or L7 authorization policy. Probably more practical example. Right, I want to disallow, let's say, writes from a certain class of client.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I expect a lot of people to just use zTunnel for to workload traffic and not to actually capture to workload traffic in the waypoint super often, but they'll need the ability sometimes. That's why it was actually suggested as the default that we would only do service capture and not to service capture, not to workload capture. The only debatable point there is if you're coming from the sidecar world and upgraded to ambient, if we didn't do to workload capture by default in the built-in Istio waypoint, would the lack of L7 telemetry cause a little bit of sticker shock? Maybe not. And I think it's a decision point reasonable people could differ on. And it might be better to err on the side of doing less, not more. I think that's my opinion, but I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts actually on that.
I do remember at one point we talked about not optimizing for the migration use case, meaning the migration from sidecars to ambient at one point. I don't know if that's still sort of the case, but like you mentioned, Louis, I think it really does boil down to what do we want to prioritize now in the present day. I think my preference for simplicity is to do the be to optimize for the per service, the to service routing. I think that's kind of what this proposal does. And if there's a big need for 2 workload, we at least have the door open in the future to do more. But like you said, reasonable people can differ on that one.
I don't really know what users want, but it'll be interesting to find out. Like if L7 level doesn't come as easily, whether or not they'll fight for it.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the Istio waypoints, right, we can make this a mesh config option, right, or like a type of config option. So even if it's not on by default, it would be reasonably easy to turn it on, if that's what people wanted. So I'm not overly worried about the negative ramifications of making the wrong choice from UX perspective here. Hence my inclination to err on doing less, not more, because it's not really hard for users to correct it if they want. But
Yeah, I agree with that.
decision.
No, I agree with that. Right. And if things are working well, then less telemetry is better. It's
Yeah, what I would actually expect is people to be generally happy with service capture. And anyway, in Ambient, right, the enablement of a waypoint is kind of this opt-in thing, right? You want to start using it because you want to start using L7 features, and then you can stop using it if you don't want those features anymore, right? And the applications don't have to change. So you get this much more dynamic experience, and that applies equally to workload traffic. And so you could say, oh, well, I need 2 workload traffic telemetry for the next hour so I can diagnose an issue and then turn it off because otherwise it's noise, right? It's too much telemetry. As Justin points out, we sometimes generate too much telemetry. And so having that dynamism is pretty
coming
powerful.
from the sidecar world. The only difference is that they'll discover that L7 telemetry is now a feature, which they had all, you know what I mean? That's now become a feature of Waypoint, whereas in sidecars, it came automatically.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that is a clear difference. Hopefully everybody understands that. The API is, after all, use waypoint, and if you don't get one. Right, and if people want to use waypoints consistently across their infrastructure, the document recommends that they do that with their CD pipeline.
Yeah, I suspect we'll see some. I think we'll see some lightweight integrations there of waypoint sprayers, effectively, that dynamically respond to services spinning up and make sure they have an associated waypoint, or that watch Istio config for anything that's relevant at layer 7 and dynamically place waypoints. But those are pretty easy to implement inside of a CI/CD pipeline. I don't see any reason they need to be part of the core product. So as long as we throw out a few blogs on how to do it, give some guidance.
If folks think Istio needs to deliver a waypoint sprayer, it's a great term, Mitch, of some kind, we can always look at that if we wanted to. But
Cube Spray
right now,
2.0.
But right now, I'm inclined not to do that.
I would agree with that.
The other thing I think people should take a long, hard look at in this doc, it's not as developed, but it's moderately developed, is the ability to use a multi-tenant waypoint, right? One that exists in a different namespace. There are a few use cases for that, right? Obviously, there's the low footprint. I don't want to run too many envoys. There's also, I need to model some big centralized piece of infrastructure as a waypoint, right? Because I need to use it for some use case. And then the third one is waypoint shielding, right? Where the waypoints themselves, there's one waypoint per namespace, but the actual waypoint declaration lives in another namespace and is subject to admin control and not to namespace owner control. So the admins can hide all of them, which I guess pseudo SaaS, for want of a better term. That could also just be a feature of the waypoint controller, by the way. So, and that is something that might want to look at, is even though you put the gateway resource in a namespace, we don't actually schedule the waypoint itself in the same namespace. That is something we can also do. And maybe that's something that Istio should itself provide an option for. Today, the reason to schedule the gateway in the namespace itself is for accounting purposes.
Yeah, I like the idea of that multi-tenant gateway. I think that'll be very valuable, particularly for use cases where you're sort of tying legacy network devices together with a service mesh. Things like IDP layers that expect to do inspection could still be hardware oriented or VM oriented, where dynamically scaling them out inside of a cluster is not really possible. But now we can route traffic to them regardless of the namespace that they exist in. So I see a lot of value there.
I agree. I think.
By the way, so go ahead, Sanjeev.
Yeah, I was just going to second that. I think there will be cases where across namespaces is just a soft tenancy, and it's better to get the benefit of sharing rather than for you don't have the risk of the security risks aren't that high, and the benefit of sharing is more desirable. So yeah, I agree.
The document talks about the security properties of those design decisions a bit. Right, there's always trade-off with sharing in terms of zero trust, right? And so people have to be cognizant of that. You don't just want people sharing willy-nilly because it's cheaper without realizing what the security ramifications of doing that product. So
right.
Like, Istio will always make statements about that, but allow you to share is basically, I think, how this is going to go.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're basically
Louis,
at time.
What do we need to do to indicate approval and to give you a green light here? There's not an approval section up at the top, but I feel like we're getting close to ready to go with this thing.
I'm sorry. There's the first and most obvious omission. Let me go fix that. We can also adopt a convention, by the way, the X in the approval section for I approve, and I approve the direction, but there's some details that can be fleshed out, but work can start, and you mark that with D. I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Let me try and cut and paste something. Your wish is my command, Mitch.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing this thing moving forward, and I can't wait to play with it once the capture stuff is built. I think it's got some really great potential.
I'm saying all the approvers, all the TOC members right now as approvers.
And we can ping them again on Monday. I think we're meeting on Monday, right?
I suspect so.
I think we had a meeting. We were supposed to meet a week ago, but I'm pretty sure that got delayed for the solo offsite. So.
Oh right, yeah. Sorry.
Well, Louis, thank you for the detailed walkthrough. I think, and for your patience answering what I think was the same question for me 3 or 4 different times. I think on the 4th time I might have gotten it, but I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, let me know if there could be better examples in the doc. We certainly tried to make sure that there are reasonable examples for a lot of things, but there's a lot.
Yeah, there is.
All right, I will stop recording. Thanks, everyone.